The room is warm in a careful way, the kind of warmth that comes from thick walls and too many bodies breathing at the same time. Fabric shifts. A chair leg settles. Someone coughs and apologizes, to no one in particular. He stands still long enough that stillness begins to feel like a choice, rather than a pause. This is the sound of unquestioned rooms. It is not quiet, it is compliant. The air does not press back. It waits. He notices these things without thinking that he is noticing them. Power has made observation automatic and reflection optional. When he first arrived in rooms like this years earlier, there were edges. He remembers that now in the way one remembers a childhood house that has since been renovated beyond recognition. Corners existed. Voices overlapped. People interrupted each other. He had to lean forward to be heard. That posture taught him something he did not realize he would later miss. Leaning forward meant there was distance to cross. Distance meant honesty had space to breathe. Now no one leans forward. They lean inward, not physically, mentally. They align themselves before speaking. He can feel it happen. The silence before someone answers has lengthened over the years, stretched like a polite hesitation that never snaps back. At first, that pause felt respectful. Then it felt efficient. Now it feels permanent. The belief he carries is simple and deeply held. Order requires alignment. Alignment requires clarity. Clarity requires one center. He did not arrive at this belief through books or arguments. It assembled itself from small successes. Each time he decided, and the room adjusted itself around him, the belief tightened. Doubt did not disappear. It simply stopped finding surfaces to land on. There is a widely accepted fact that as his authority consolidated, the court moved where he lived, eventually orbiting a single residence built to make proximity visible. Everyone knows this. Children learn it without needing to understand it. Less discussed is how the daily rituals were structured to eliminate unsupervised silence. Doors opened in sequence. Attendance became choreography. Even privacy was scheduled. Historians still debate whether this was designed primarily to control rivals or to protect the ruler from unpredictability. The rooms answer neither way. They simply remember. He learned early that people tell the truth sideways. They do it in tone, in timing, in what they choose not to say. Back when people still risked these sideways truths, he listened carefully. He built a reputation for listening. That reputation was useful. It brought information. It also brought a particular kind of relief. Others felt lighter after speaking. He felt heavier, but the weight felt purposeful. Carrying it gave shape to his days. As obedience became reliable, listening changed character. There was less to decode. Sentences arrived already smoothed. Even complaints came wrapped in gratitude. It is difficult to listen deeply when nothing resists. He sometimes wonders when exactly he stopped waiting for the second sentence, the one that follows after someone decides whether honesty is safe. It may have been gradual enough to feel like progress. Comfort has that talent. He stands in the room and realizes that he knows how everyone will speak before they do. This used to feel like mastery. Now it feels like repetition. Repetition is not boring. That is a common misunderstanding. Repetition is calming. It reassures the mind that the future will resemble the past, closely enough to be navigable. The danger is not monotony. The danger is believing that predictability is the same thing as truth. A fringe detail that survives mostly in footnotes is how he insisted on certain architectural choices that eliminated alcoves and narrow passages, wide corridors, clear sight lines, no place for a conversation to fold in on itself. The official explanation involved light and air. The unofficial effect was that words traveled farther than intended. This was praised as openness. It also meant that speaking honestly required an audience. People adapt quickly to that condition. One of the understated jokes of power is that it makes everyone very good at reading the weather while convincing them they have no influence over it. Another is that when everyone agrees with you, you start missing disagreement without being able to admit that is what you miss. A third, almost private joke is that silence becomes so polite, it feels rude to interrupt it with the truth. He tells himself that honesty is still possible. He believes this. Belief is important. It creates a sense of continuity. If honesty exists in theory, its absence in practice can be attributed to timing, or tact, or loyalty. He trusts loyalty. Loyalty feels solid. It does not argue back. When someone tells him what he already knows, he experiences it as confirmation rather than redundancy. Confirmation is efficient. It keeps the day moving. There was a moment, years ago, when someone spoke out of alignment. It was not dramatic. No raised voice, no accusation, just a factual observation delivered without cushioning. The room reacted before he did. Breath held, eyes lowered. The speaker realized the error halfway through the sentence. He remembers this not because of what he did next, but because of what he felt. A tightening behind the eyes, not anger, surprise. The world had briefly failed to follow its pattern. He corrected the situation calmly. He always does. Calm is a skill. Calm allows correction without spectacle. The person was not punished publicly. That would have been inefficient. They were simply no longer present in rooms like this. Absence is quieter than discipline. The room learned. He learned too, though the lesson did not arrive as knowledge. It arrived as atmosphere. From then on, honesty had to survive without space. It had to compress itself into safe shapes, suggestions, clarifications, questions that were not questions. He noticed that people began to speak more about process than substance. Process is neutral. Process cannot disagree. This was framed as maturity. He accepted that framing. It felt reasonable at the time. He believes that people are relieved by structure. He believes that uncertainty exhausts them. These beliefs are not false. They are incomplete. Incompleteness rarely announces itself. It settles in quietly, like dust on surfaces no one touches anymore. He does not ask for honesty explicitly. That would be unnecessary. He assumes it. Assumption is another form of comfort. As he moves through the room, eyes follow him without effort. This is often described as respect. It might be. It might also be habit. Habits have a way of impersonating virtues when repeated long enough. He nods. Someone smiles a fraction too late. Another person adjusts their stance to mirror his. Mirroring is unconscious. That is what makes it flattering. The sound of unquestioned rooms includes laughter that arrives on time. Not too early, not too late. He recognizes this rhythm. He helped create it. That recognition brings a sense of ownership that borders on pride, but never quite crosses into it. Pride would require comparison. There is no comparison available. He thinks back to when he still had peers, not rivals, peers, people who spoke without calculating trajectory. Conversations then had friction. Friction produced heat. Heat clarified things. Now clarity arrives pre-cooled. It does not burn. It also does not illuminate much beyond what is already visible. There's a belief nested inside his larger belief, small enough to go unnoticed. If something were truly wrong, someone would say so. This belief feels logical. It rests on the assumption that honesty is an instinct that overrides fear. He once thought this. He no longer thinks about it. That is how certainty hardens. not through argument, but through neglect. He tells himself that the silence in the room is a sign of focus, that everyone is aligned on the task at hand, that dissent would only slow things down. He is not wrong. Speed increases when resistance decreases. The question of direction does not arise when movement is smooth. At night, alone, he sometimes remembers the sound of disagreement. Not the content, the sound, a hesitation, a breath taken before risk. He does not miss the inconvenience. He misses the signal. Signals told him where the edges were. Without edges, space feels infinite and strangely airless. The room waits. He speaks. They respond. The cycle completes itself with mechanical grace. He does not notice when honesty leaves. It does not leave all at once. It thins. It becomes translucent. Eventually, it is still there technically, but it no longer interrupts anything. That is when power feels most stable. The irony, which he would appreciate if it were presented as irony, is that obedience erased the very conditions that once kept him informed. He does not frame it that way. He frames it as peace. Peace is easier to defend. Peace sounds responsible. Peace fills rooms without making noise. As the meeting ends, chairs move again. Apologies return. The air shifts. He remains where he is for a moment longer than necessary. Stillness has become a habit. In the quiet after compliance, he feels a faint pressure, like a thought that almost forms. It does not concern him. Unformed thoughts are common at the end of long days. He steps forward. The room adjusts. Silence closes behind him. Intact. The room is warm in a careful way, the kind of warmth that arrives before anyone else does. The air does not move, unless someone decides it should. Footsteps stop short of the door, not because they are told to, but because they know. Inside, there is the sound of fabric settling, the faint scrape of a chair placed exactly where it always goes, and a pause that stretches just long enough to feel intentional. He is surrounded. He is not reached. Distance does not begin with walls. It begins with permission. The permission to approach, to speak, to laugh, to interrupt. When power matures, it rearranges these permissions quietly. People still come close. They stand near. They sit within arm's length. They hear his breathing. But nothing passes between them that has not already been approved by the room itself. Access is everywhere. Contact is nowhere. He notices this without naming it. The mind adjusts faster when it is not forced to explain itself. At first it feels efficient. Conversations shorten. Interruptions vanish. Words land without friction. He can finish a thought without having to defend it. This seems like respect. It is widely accepted that Napoleon Bonaparte filled rooms wherever he went, that officers and ministers gathered constantly around him, that his presence organized entire days. What is less discussed is how little of that proximity allowed anything unfiltered to survive. Historians still debate whether his increasing reliance on written reports over face-to-face disagreement was preference or necessity, and the debate itself tells you something about how narrow the space had become. When everyone can hear you, no one speaks to you. The difference is subtle, and it flatters him at first. He does not have to lean forward to be heard. He does not have to repeat himself. He does not have to ask follow-up questions. The room anticipates him. That anticipation feels like intimacy if you do not look at it too closely. He tells himself this is what leadership looks like when it works. It is a clean exchange. He gives direction. Others give execution. The mess of back and forth is gone. It saves time. He has always respected efficiency. That belief slides into place easily. He is never alone. This is the important part. There are always people nearby, advisors, guards, attendants, men who have known him for years and men who have only just arrived. The noise of human presence is constant, and yet the conversations flatten. They become exchanges of confirmation. Even disagreement arrives pre-softened. It presents itself as concern, as clarification, as a question that already contains the answer. He hears the shape of caution before the words reach him. He starts answering before they finish. This feels like mastery. It also feels like relief. A strange thing happens when no one pushes back. Thoughts stop testing themselves. They settle faster. Doubt does not disappear. It simply has nowhere to go. He still feels it sometimes, late at night or in the pause between decisions, but it remains internal, unchallenged, unsharpened. Confidence thickens not because it is proven, but because it is undisturbed. He begins to trust it the way one trusts gravity. It is always there. It does not need to be argued with. He tells himself that intimacy is overrated, that closeness clouds judgment, that distance protects clarity. This belief feels practical, not defensive. He has watched others lose themselves in friendships, in affections, in loyalties that demand compromise. He does not want that. He wants alignment. He wants people near him to move when he moves, not to pull him sideways. The room obliges. The people closest to him become the least likely to touch anything unplanned. There is a joke he hears once, delivered carefully, about how one must book time with him to disagree. It is said with a smile and a slight bow, and everyone laughs in the appropriate way. He allows a thin smile. It is funny, technically. Joke one passes without comment. The humor rests on the surface and does not ask anything of him. That is how humor works now. Proximity begins to replace trust. If someone is near, they must be loyal. If they are loyal, they must be honest. This logic feels sound when examined quickly. It breaks down if you stay with it too long. He does not. He watches who stays. He watches who returns. He watches who looks comfortable in the room. Comfort becomes a proxy for truth. This is not arrogance, it is pattern recognition applied too narrowly. He notices that bad news travels differently now. It arrives wrapped in explanations, escorted by reassurances, padded with alternatives. The facts are still there, technically. They are just quieter. He has to listen harder to find them. Sometimes he does not. The room moves on. Decisions are made. Later, someone will mention that the warning was given. They will be right. It was given. It just never crossed the distance that mattered. The belief that forms here is simple and dangerous. If something were truly wrong, someone would say so clearly. The belief hardens because it is never contradicted. People assume he already knows, or they assume he does not want to hear it, or they assume it is not their place. These assumptions look identical from where he stands. Silence covers them all. Silence becomes evidence. It is a widely accepted fact that Napoleon preferred to dictate letters at a relentless pace, sometimes walking, sometimes reclining, words pouring out, while scribes struggled to keep up. A less discussed detail is the extent to which this method reduced interruption. Historians still debate whether this was simply temperament or a way to prevent questions. The distinction matters less than the effect. The distance between thought and execution narrowed. The distance between thought and challenge widened. People think access means closeness. They confuse visibility with vulnerability. He is visible constantly. Everyone can see him. They can observe his habits, his moods, the way he takes his tea, the way he pauses before answering. They cannot reach the part of him that revises itself out loud. That part has gone quiet. It does not trust the room anymore. not because the room is hostile, but because it is too smooth. There is comfort in this. He sleeps better when no one surprises him. He moves faster when no one interrupts. He makes decisions without the drag of consensus. This feels like adulthood, like maturity. He has outgrown the need to be understood. He tells himself this with a calm certainty that would have unsettled his younger self. The younger version wanted to be seen. This version wants to be effective. Another joke surfaces, this one from his own mind. He thinks that if everyone agrees with him, it saves time on arguing with himself. He almost laughs. Joke 2 stays internal. It amuses him just enough to feel clever, not enough to feel exposed. Distance disguised as access also alters memory. He begins to remember conversations differently than they happened. He remembers agreement more clearly than hesitation. He remembers affirmation more vividly than caution. This is not deception. It is selection. The mind edits for coherence. He prefers a story where the room aligns naturally around him. It feels orderly. Disorder exists elsewhere. There are fewer moments now when someone tells him something he did not expect to hear. When it happens, it irritates him more than it alarms him. Surprise feels inefficient. He interprets it as poor preparation rather than useful information. This interpretation slides into place without resistance. It protects his sense of command. It also narrows his field of vision. He believes that emotional distance is the price of scale, that one cannot remain reachable and still remain effective at this level. This belief is common. It is shared. It feels reasonable. It is also convenient. It allows him to stop checking whether the distance is doing more than protecting him. It allows him to treat isolation as a professional requirement rather than a personal condition. He notices that he no longer waits for people to finish their sentences. He anticipates endings. He fills gaps. This speeds things up. It also teaches others to leave gaps unfilled. Conversations become shorter, not because there is less to say, but because there is less room to say it. He tells himself that he can always ask if something important is missing. He rarely does. Asking would slow things down. A third joke arrives from someone else, delivered with care. They remark that the room feels smaller when he enters, as if gravity increases slightly. It is meant as praise. He nods. Joke 3 lands and settles. The humor here is involuntary. It acknowledges something true without examining it. Distance becomes the default. It stops feeling like something that happened and starts feeling like the natural order. He no longer remembers when people spoke freely around him. He assumes they still do, just not about trivial things. He assumes he hears what matters. This assumption is rarely tested, because testing it would require inviting disruption. What makes this stage dangerous is not arrogance. It is alignment. Everything fits. The system works. The days run smoothly. Decisions are executed. Resistance is minimal. From the inside, nothing feels wrong. The atmosphere feels controlled, breathable, calm. The silence feels earned. He is close to everyone. He is unreachable. Both statements feel true. He does not yet see the cost of holding them together. The room is warm in the way old buildings become warm at night. Not from heat, but from having held it all day. Wood breathes quietly. Fabric keeps its shape. The air does not move unless someone else moves it first. He sits still and notices how stillness now arrives before he does. It is present, waiting for him. The chair accepts his weight without protest. The table offers its surface without asking what will be placed there. Even the light behaves. It does not flicker. It does not challenge the eyes. It stays exactly where it is supposed to stay. This is what certainty feels like when it has finished growing. It feels like a room that already knows your outline. He believes something simple, not loudly, not even consciously. He believes that events arrange themselves around clarity. That confusion belongs to those who hesitate. That doubt is a luxury of people who have not yet been proven right often enough. This belief did not arrive all at once. It accumulated. It was reinforced quietly every time a decision worked well enough to avoid correction. Every time resistance softened instead of sharpened. Every time an objection arrived already apologizing. Over time, certainty stopped feeling like a position and started feeling like shelter. Certainty is often mistaken for arrogance by people who have not lived inside it. From the inside, it feels more like insulation. It keeps the cold questions out. It muffles noise. It allows long, uninterrupted stretches of thought. He does not think of himself as infallible. He thinks of himself as aligned. That word matters. Alignment suggests that something larger agrees with you, that the direction of motion is shared. When the world seems to move in the same direction you are facing, it becomes difficult to remember why turning was ever necessary. He notices that when someone disagrees now, they do so carefully. Their disagreement arrives wrapped in permission. It asks to be allowed to exist. This is new. There was a time when disagreement came raw and unfiltered. It had edges. It cut conversations short. It forced pauses. He remembers that time faintly. It feels like remembering a former climate, colder, less predictable. Historians still debate whether early rulers depended more on dissent than on loyalty. He does not debate this. He feels it as a mild nostalgia that passes quickly. There is a widely accepted fact that power consolidates faster than it dissolves. Empires expand in decades and fracture over centuries. He knows this in the way people know common weather patterns. It does not feel academic. It feels practical. When things move in one direction for long enough, it becomes reasonable to assume they will continue. There is also a less discussed detail that appears in letters and marginal notes from courts long past. Rulers often slept poorly during periods of apparent stability, not during war or revolt, but during calm. The body did not receive enough contradiction to discharge its tension. He sleeps lightly. He tells himself it is discipline. He does not ask why his dreams have narrowed. They repeat. The same corridors, the same doors that open without resistance. Even sleep has become efficient. It is not restful, but it is reliable. That counts for something. Certainty makes time feel smoother. Days pass without friction. Decisions no longer announce themselves. They emerge already formed. He does not remember choosing many of the things he now defends. They feel like they chose him earlier. This removes strain. It also removes surprise. Surprise used to be instructive. Now it is mildly irritating. When something unexpected happens, his first instinct is not curiosity, but correction. He feels this instinct and accepts it. Acceptance is easier than revision. There is a small joke hidden here somewhere about flexibility, but it does not laugh well in this room. He holds a belief about people that has slowly hardened. He believes that most people want to be relieved of decision. That clarity offered from above feels like kindness when it is consistent. He did not start with this belief. It formed as he watched relief cross faces when he spoke plainly, when options collapsed into instruction, when responsibility transferred cleanly. The relief was real. That mattered. It made the belief feel humane. Over time, he forgot that relief and trust are not the same thing. One is immediate. The other takes longer and requires friction. Friction is inefficient. He has learned to dislike inefficiency. Confidence narrows doubt, not by defeating it, but by crowding it. Doubt requires space. It needs room to ask questions that do not have immediate answers. In his world, answers arrive quickly, sometimes before the question has finished forming. He notices that his own doubts now arrive already framed as logistical concerns. Timing, resources, presentation. They no longer ask whether, they ask how. This feels like maturity. It feels like progress. It also feels final in a way that is difficult to name. There is a second understated joke in this realization. He once thought clarity would bring peace. It mostly brought meetings. Meetings are not peaceful, but they are predictable. Predictability can masquerade as peace when you are tired enough. Certainty also changes the texture of memory. Past mistakes soften. They are reinterpreted as necessary steps. Past risks are remembered as calculated. Even accidents begin to look intentional when enough time passes without consequence. He is not rewriting history deliberately. The mind does this on its own when it senses that stability depends on coherence. Incoherent memories create tension. Tension suggests vulnerability. Vulnerability invites challenge. He does not feel challenged often anymore. This absence feels earned. A widely accepted historical fact sits quietly behind this feeling. Long reigns often produce fewer reforms than short turbulent ones. Change requires urgency. Urgency requires uncertainty. He has reduced uncertainty effectively. This makes him efficient. It also makes him slow to notice when conditions shift. He still believes conditions shift because of external forces. He has not considered that his own certainty might be one of them. There is a fringe detail some scholars mention in passing. During the late stages of consolidated power, rulers often relied on smaller and smaller circles of counsel, not out of paranoia, but out of convenience. Fewer voices meant faster alignment. Faster alignment meant less internal strain. He appreciates efficiency. He tells himself that large groups dilute responsibility. He may be right. He may also be narrowing the range of reality that reaches him. Both can be true without conflict. That is the problem. His confidence has weight now. It settles into rooms before he does. People feel it and adjust. He senses the adjustment and interprets it as respect. Respect is easier to carry than uncertainty. It fits well. It does not snag on self-reflection. He does not feel arrogant. Arrogance requires comparison. He feels inevitable. Inevitability does not compare. It assumes. Certainty becomes gravity when it stops asking permission. It bends conversations. It curves decisions. People speak differently around it. He notices this and feels a faint satisfaction that he does not examine too closely. Examination would introduce doubt. Doubt would slow things down. He has responsibilities. He tells himself this often. It sounds reasonable. Reasonable things rarely demand interrogation. There's a third small joke here, and it is almost kind. He once believed power would make him lonely. Instead, it made him busy. Busy is not the opposite of lonely, but it is an effective distraction. The danger does not announce itself. It arrives as comfort, as smooth days, as nights where the room feels already arranged. Certainty feels like alignment, until alignment becomes enclosure. He does not feel trapped. That is important. Traps feel sudden. This feels earned. He sits in the warm room and lets the quiet confirm him. The confirmation does not speak. It does not need to. It has been repeating itself for years. Somewhere in the mind a question tries to form. It is not sharp enough to cut through the insulation. It dissolves before it can shape itself into doubt. He does not notice its absence. Absences rarely announce themselves. They simply leave more space for what remains. What remains feels solid, heavy, dependable. He rests there. The belief that holds him now is not that he is right. It is that being right has become the default condition. Defaults are powerful. They remove effort. They conserve energy. They feel natural even when they are constructed. He has lived inside this default long enough that alternatives feel abstract. Abstract things do not demand immediate attention. He attends to what is concrete. The room, the chair, the quiet. The certainty that tomorrow will resemble today closely enough to plan for it without anxiety. Historians still debate whether such certainty is a cause or a symptom of collapse. He does not debate this. Debate would require imagining a different internal weather. He has adjusted to this climate. It suits him. It keeps things orderly. Order feels safe. Safety feels deserved. The chain closes without sound. The room remains warm. The air remains still. His thoughts move in well-worn paths that no longer surprise him. He does not feel fear. He does not feel triumph. He feels aligned. That feeling has weight. It settles. It does not move easily, and for now it does not need to. The room is warm in a way that feels intentional, as if the walls learned long ago how to hold heat without announcing it. Fabric barely moves. The air smells faintly of wax and polished wood, the kind of smell that never leaves once it has decided it belongs somewhere. He stands still, because stillness has become effortless, and because movement now feels like a suggestion that something might change if he did. The sound of his own breathing arrives late to him, as if it has to cross a distance before it is allowed to exist. There are people nearby, close enough that he could touch them, if that were still the point. He does not. Being untouchable has made contact unnecessary, and unnecessary things quietly lose their urgency. This is what immunity from challenge does first. It slows time without stopping it. It creates a gentle lag between thought and consequence, long enough for certainty to stretch out and get comfortable. Once, resistance had been useful. It had shown him where he ended and others began. Now resistance feels like static, something that belongs to older rooms and less disciplined arrangements. The absence of it feels clean. There is a pleasure in that cleanliness he never names, mostly because naming it would require admitting that pleasure is still capable of surprising him. Power does not announce its final form. It becomes atmospheric. It seeps into posture, into the way silence gathers around a person and waits for instruction. He notices it that people have learned not only when to speak, but when to look thoughtful without thinking too much. This is not something he demanded. It organized itself. Control, once achieved, prefers not to be seen working. It prefers to feel like gravity. Historians still debate whether such environments are consciously designed or simply emerge when obedience becomes safer than honesty. And he would find that debate faintly flattering if he spent time thinking about it. There was a time when being questioned felt like pressure from the outside, an interruption. Now pressure feels internal, self-generated, an obligation to remain consistent with the version of himself everyone else has already agreed on. Untouchable does not mean relaxed. It means contained. Every doubt has to negotiate with the architecture of certainty before it is allowed to exist. Most do not make it past the door. Those that do arrive smaller than they were meant to be, and he treats them like guests who have overstayed their relevance. The belief he carries, quietly and without ceremony, is that stability depends on him remaining unaltered, not correct, not virtuous, unaltered. Change would introduce variables, and variables invite conversation. Conversation, he has learned, is how erosion begins. So certainty hardens. It does not become loud. It becomes dense. It acquires weight. People feel it before they understand it. He feels it, too, pressing inward, shaping his decisions before they reach language. This is where untouchability reveals its cost. Without challenge, self-trust becomes recursive. He trusts himself because he has learned to trust himself, because there has been no reason not to. The loop tightens. Evidence is no longer required. Alignment replaces verification. He is not arrogant about it. Arrogance would imply comparison. He has simply moved beyond the need to compare. That, he tells himself, is maturity. It is also efficient. Efficiency has always felt like virtue when time is scarce, and time always feels scarce once everything depends on you. At court, or what functions as court now, the rituals are precise. This is a widely accepted historical fact, that elaborate routines were used to center authority and make access visible without being available. The morning lever of Louis XIV is often cited as an example, where nobles attended the king's waking as if proximity itself were currency. Less discussed is how many of those rituals were quietly adjusted over time to reduce unpredictability, down to who held a candlestick and for how long. Order, once established, resents improvisation. He appreciates that about it. Improvisation is charming until it asks for space. He notices that advice arrives pre-softened. It comes shaped to fit decisions he has already made. This is not deception. It is adaptation. People are good at adaptation when they want to remain near warmth. The untouchable do not need to demand loyalty. They create climates where loyalty is simply the least complicated posture. He is aware of this in the abstract. Awareness does not diminish the effect. If anything, it makes it feel deserved. There is a private joke he allows himself when someone explains the obvious with great care, as if clarity were a rare mineral. He does not laugh. Laughter would suggest excess energy, and excess energy implies uncertainty. Instead, he nods, and the nod is enough to send relief rippling outward. Relief is an underappreciated tool of governance. People will forgive many things in exchange for not having to wonder. The pressure he feels is peculiar because it arrives wearing his own face. External threats have been managed, absorbed, or reframed. What remains is the obligation to remain inevitable. To be touched would mean acknowledging that something outside him could alter his trajectory. He cannot afford that, not because it would be dangerous, but because it would be disappointing. Disappointment is harder to manage than fear. Fear can be directed. Disappointment lingers. At night, when the room's finally empty and the air cools just enough to remind him that physics still applies, he revisits decisions without reopening them. This is a subtle but important distinction. He reviews without reconsidering. The past becomes a museum of closed doors, each one labeled stable, necessary, resolved. Doubt narrows here, not through force but through fatigue. It is easier to accept certainty than to relive the labor of choosing. He remembers earlier versions of himself that believed challenge was a sign of engagement. That belief has not vanished. It has been repurposed. Now challenge is something he imagines handling well, hypothetically, should it ever arrive. The hypothetical remains comfortable because it remains hypothetical. Historians still debate whether rulers in such positions truly lose access to dissent, or simply stop recognizing it when it changes shape. There is an understated absurdity in being surrounded by guards, whose primary function is symbolic. He is rarely in danger. Everyone knows that. The performance continues anyway, because symbols, once established, become necessary to the people who rely on them. He once considered reducing the display, then realized how many schedules depended on it, and decided against causing unnecessary paperwork. Untouchable also means that mistakes become theoretical. Small errors are absorbed by the system before they can be felt. Large ones are reframed until they resemble strategy. This is not cynicism, it is alignment. The system wants to survive, and he has become its most reliable constant. Comfort grows here, thick and quiet. Comfort is dangerous not because it seduces, but because it convinces. It tells him that the absence of alarm is evidence of correctness. There is a less discussed detail in many reigns like his, the way personal habits harden into institutional rhythms. Sleep patterns become policy, preferences become expectations. When he pauses before speaking, rooms learn patience. When he speaks quickly, rooms learn urgency. This feedback loop would be amusing if it were not so comprehensive. He allows himself a second private joke when someone praises his decisiveness moments after he has simply chosen not to think aloud. Self-trust, once externalized, returns heavier. He believes that if something were truly wrong, it would have announced itself by now. Silence becomes proof. This belief settles into him with the steadiness of something that no longer needs reinforcement. Confidence hardens into gravity. It pulls decisions toward it without asking permission. He does not feel powerful in these moments. He feels necessary. Necessity is more convincing than power. The danger here is not chaos. Chaos would be visible. The danger is the smoothness of it all, the way days arrange themselves without friction. Control removes noise, and without noise, it becomes difficult to tell whether anything is still moving. He senses this occasionally, like a faint pressure change before weather shifts, but the sensation passes. There's always another document, another meeting, another quiet confirmation that the world remains where he left it. He holds a belief he rarely inspects, that being untouchable is the same as being stable. Stability feels like virtue when so many depend on it. Questioning that equivalence would require admitting that touch might not always mean damage. He does not go there. The belief does its work without demanding attention. In the end, what weighs on him is not fear of being challenged, but the subtle exhaustion of never being surprised. Surprise requires access. Access requires vulnerability. Vulnerability feels inefficient. He allows himself one last dry amusement at how many people would describe his life as enviable, without considering how carefully it has been sealed. The room remains warm. The air remains still. He remains where he is, untouchable, feeling the pressure from inside and outside, aligned so perfectly that it becomes difficult to tell which direction it is coming from. The room is quiet, in a way that feels deliberate, the kind of quiet that has been practiced over years until it becomes its own presence. He moves through it like someone tracing the edges of a familiar painting, careful not to disturb the air, careful not to stir even the faintest ripple of disagreement. The windows are shut against any real intrusion, and the servants' footsteps, though soft, have learned their rhythm to the point that they might as well be a metronome. There is comfort in this, not a comfort that softens, but one that steadies, that presses down evenly across the chest, until the heart learns to measure itself against the weight of predictable reactions. Every nod, every carefully phrased assent, every measured sigh from those around him has been choreographed not by him, but by the gravitational pull of his presence. It is not force, not even subtle coercion. It is the quietness of compliance that makes him untouchable, and it feels inevitable. He likely believes that smooth compliance is a mark of his own discernment. There is a quiet pride in recognizing that others have adjusted themselves to avoid friction, that resistance has been extinguished not through threats, but through sheer constancy. And yet this is a paradox that would have seemed absurd had it been named. The absence of challenge slowly erodes the ability to trust the self. Without friction, how does one know where one begins and where the reflection of others ends? He notices it in fleeting moments, an almost imperceptible hesitation before speaking, a thought that lingers and fades because no one has interrupted it in years. Historians still debate whether rulers who inspire seamless obedience ever perceive the boundaries between influence and thought. He does not debate, he observes, and observation in this context is indistinguishable from acceptance. There is an odd rhythm to it, the way loyalty circulates through the rooms unseen and unspoken. The messengers deliver letters that no one reads aloud. The advisors nod before their own reasoning is complete. A dry amusement might rise if he allowed it. One could almost count the number of times someone has moved a paper without needing direction and imagine them applauding themselves quietly, thinking themselves clever. And yet there is no laughter here, only the kind of quiet that stretches like a shadow across every surface. Even the furniture seems to understand. The chairs arranged just so. The books left open on familiar pages. The floor polished in a pattern that marks out paths for feet that have become almost invisible. A second understated joke might be that the carpets, though ornate, never complain, and sometimes he pictures them shifting in mild protest, if only they had the capacity. The mind adjusts to the absence of resistance like a muscle held tense for hours. Eventually it relaxes into the tension itself. He walks through the halls and considers loyalty as a substance, a thick, almost viscous material that fills every gap where contradiction might have once entered. Without friction, the inner landscape feels flattened, smooth, predictable. And he recognizes, perhaps quietly delights in it, that the same smoothness that keeps others obedient also keeps his own doubts at bay. Confidence hardens, but it is a confidence built on compliance rather than conquest. There is an odd humor here, too. One could almost say he is as obedient to the silence as the silence is to him. The thought is fleeting, amusing in its symmetry, and he lets it pass without comment. He considers the meetings where agreement is instantaneous. The advisors nod without hesitation. The ministers echo without reflection. And sometimes he allows himself the private acknowledgement that friction, once present, had revealed his own limitations, had tested his understanding, had forced him to confront the faint edges of uncertainty. Now it is absent, replaced by a steady tide of affirmation. A third quiet joke forms in his mind, almost invisible. In this smoothness, one might accidentally discover oneself alone, surrounded by people who mirror the shape of obedience, but none of its weight. There is a subtle thrill in this realization, unsettling yet satisfying, like noticing a faint crack in the ceiling of a room you've built yourself. The historical record notes that rulers often rely on loyalty to maintain power, but it rarely captures what it feels like to inhabit that loyalty day by day. He has watched it accumulate like dust in corners that are rarely seen. The faint lines of habit, the quiet patterns that form in response to absence rather than action. He knows, probably believes, that this is an achievement in itself, a world where resistance has been domesticated so thoroughly that even he, the architect of its absence, sometimes forgets what opposition once felt like. Yet this is also a form of pressure. Compliance exerts its own pull. It shapes the mind, compresses doubt, and channels thought along paths so narrow that deviation becomes almost invisible. There is a moment when he pauses in the library, looking at the books that line the walls. Few are touched, even fewer read, and he imagines them whispering criticisms that no one will hear. There is a comfort in that imagined whispering, a confirmation that the absence of friction is not merely external, but internal as well. The smooth obedience that surrounds him mirrors the internal smoothing of his own instincts. He recognizes that he is untouchable, yes, but also, quietly, that he has become untouchable in part by touching nothing, by testing nothing, by allowing all boundaries to soften around him until only certainty remains. And in this room, in the stillness, he understands the strange duality. The loyalty that requires no explanation is at once liberating and confining. It allows him to act, to think, to exist without challenge. But it also traps him in the very pattern it enforces. He might have once considered this an irony. Now he considers it inevitable. The faintest smile flickers at the thought that perhaps he is as much a prisoner of smooth compliance as those who surround him. A joke here, if one could call it that, would be that he sometimes wonders if the rugs whisper too, noticing how even his steps conform to the rhythm he set long ago. He likely believes deeply that such obedience is proof of mastery. Yet mastery, in this sense, is not about conquest or victory. It is about absence, the absence of resistance, the absence of surprise, the absence of friction that might reveal his own limitations. And in that absence, a certain calm grows, like a slow tide filling the spaces between stones. He listens to it, letting the stillness press against him, knowing that one day the smoothness itself will be remembered, though not fully understood, by those who study him. Historians might debate whether loyalty without friction is sustainable, whether it ultimately serves the ruler or consumes him from within. He does not debate. He only allows the quiet, unbroken rhythm to continue, acknowledging that the greatest obedience is often invisible, and the weight it exerts can be heavier than any opposition. Even in the smallest gestures, the habitual bow, the glance that never lingers too long, he senses the larger pattern, the quiet architecture of compliance. It has removed the texture of contradiction from his surroundings, and he has allowed it to do so, cultivating it like a gardener who removes every thorn to preserve the shape of a hedge. And yet in these moments of reflection, he might allow himself a faint amusement, the first almost joke, that even a hedge can grow wild in corners unseen. The second is that perhaps the walls, in their silent rigidity, enjoy the order imposed upon them. The third is that he too, in some faint way, is part of that silent jest, recognizing that smooth loyalty is a kind of mirror in which one might see oneself endlessly repeated. He does not seek to question it. There is a certain satisfaction in knowing that nothing moves without permission, that patterns once chaotic have now been disciplined into predictability. The room, the silence, the obedience, all are an extension of a mind that has grown comfortable with certainty, a mind that has learned to trust the reflexive conformity of others as a form of reassurance. And yet, as the night deepens, as shadows stretch across the floors polished to a faint gleam, he knows that in the absence of friction, the self finds its limits in unexpected ways. The smoothness becomes a lens through which he observes his own capacity for doubt. And even here, in the deepest quiet, he recognizes the subtle thrill of inevitability, the almost imperceptible excitement in realizing that loyalty can be both shelter and trap. And so he moves through the halls again, unconsciously measuring the space around him, tracing the familiar paths with the certainty that has been slowly carved by years of unchallenged authority. He feels almost humorously the invisible pressure of the obedience that surrounds him, the gentle weight of minds adjusted to his presence, and he allows the quiet smile to linger, knowing it is one of the few things left unmirrored. The calm, the silence, the smoothness, all converge into a single sensation, almost like breathing, almost like a pulse, almost like recognition that in loyalty without friction, he has finally found a rhythm that is his own, and yet belongs entirely to the world he shaped. The room is empty in a way that feels deliberate, not accidental. The candlelight, flickering against polished wood, pulls shadows across the floor with slow patience, like a clock that has forgotten urgency. I can hear the faint hiss of the flame, a constant companion that makes every creak of the house sound heavier than it is. The air smells faintly of wax and old leather, a combination that somehow smells of finality without any drama. Outside, the wind presses against the shutters, but the noise is distant, peripheral, easily ignored. Inside there is a different kind of movement, one that no one else can perceive, one that is measured and inevitable. Power, once vivid and loud, now hums like a deep, unremarkable chord in the background of thought. It has lost its bragging edges and its alarms. Even the awareness that power can fail feels trivial in this quiet. There is a rhythm in this room, not the rhythm of ambition or fear, but the rhythm of inevitability. The furniture does not judge, the shadows do not conspire, and the walls do not gossip. They only exist, witnesses to the mind that has spent years arranging its own collapse with the precision of someone who has learned that disorder is not external, but internal. Historians still debate whether the mind that governs without opposition is more vulnerable or less. In this room, vulnerability is irrelevant, not because it has been mastered, but because it has been surrendered in the slow accumulation of control. Every choice made decades earlier now reads itself as necessary, a narrative that feels carved into the air. Even mistakes, if they existed at all, seem to have occurred to test a theory that no one could articulate at the time. And yet, the theory is here, tangible, in the way the candle leans into the draft, in the way the shadows tremble against the floor. There is a satisfaction in this alignment, though it is quiet and unacknowledged, like the satisfaction of noticing a seam in a wall that no one else can see. I remember that the subject believed, truly believed, that collapse, when it came, would feel like an intrusion from the world outside. But the truth, which the candle seems to hint at with every slow flicker, is that collapse had already aligned in the mind long before it appeared anywhere else. The outside world was merely late. Decisions, once urgent, are now archival. The weight of inevitability presses not as judgment, but as a companion that has been walking beside him all along. Dryly, one might note that he always appreciated punctuality in all things, except time itself, which was mostly inconvenient. There is an odd humor in the precision of his arrangements. The floors, the books, the letters left unsent, every artifact is a marker of control. He had once joked, quietly, that order was the only thing that never asked for loyalty, a statement that now sounds like prophecy rather than wit. The quiet rooms echo with reminders that the mind can orchestrate itself, that collapse is not a violent actor but a patient one, arriving only when every misalignment has been catalogued and rendered inert. There is a joke somewhere in there about how the cat always knew more than anyone, and perhaps it did, though no one had noticed. The calm that has settled is not relief. Relief implies fear, implies tension released. This is something else, a form of quiet observation that approaches detachment. Even the historical fact that empires crumble, that advisors err, and that reputations shift like sand in the wind, feels ornamental here, like background noise in a library where no one reads anymore. He sits with the certainty that the world is late to notice what he already understood, and that certainty itself has weight, shaping decisions with an invisible hand. The subtle joke of it all is that certainty, which once comforted, now isolates. One wonders whether he ever smiled, even briefly, when realizing that the patterns he predicted were unfolding exactly as anticipated. One of the fringe details that has often been overlooked is that he maintained a ritual of silence for an hour each day, not as meditation, but as calibration. In that time, the mind rehearsed its own alignment, testing assumptions against memory and expectation. Perhaps it was the quiet that allowed inevitability to settle, the unbroken hours when no one demanded obedience, only presence. And yet, as any historian who digs deep enough might speculate, the ritual may have been superfluous. Inevitability could have found its way in through the cracks of sleepless nights, through the constant hum of minor decisions, through the whispers of things never said. There is a dry amusement in imagining that all of this effort was both essential and irrelevant at the same time, a paradox that the mind could hold comfortably. The idea of being untouchable, now refined into a soft certainty, reveals its quiet cruelty. In the final moments, nothing resists, nothing contradicts, and nothing reminds him of himself except for the slow flicker of flame and the deliberate creak of the floor. Even the room conspires to make him feel that he has arranged everything perfectly, that every misstep has been accounted for. Yet, he is not triumphant. Triumph would be loud, performative, and he has long since learned to find satisfaction in observation rather than declaration. There is a faint joke that could be made about how he preferred shadows to people, and the shadows, somehow, seem to approve. As the night deepens, there is the sense that even time has stopped asking questions. The wind rattles the shutters, but the sound is distant, again, like a reminder of a world that arrives late to its own events. He has long known that collapse is not a visitor, but an internal accumulation of weight, a slow organizing principle that the mind allows to arrange itself before the body must reckon with it. There is a moment of dry humor in imagining someone expecting drama when none was required, that the spectacle of inevitable alignment is invisible to all but the one who feels it. And there is the deeper humor that perhaps no one else would ever feel the same way. But it matters little. The mind has its own consistency, and consistency does not require witnesses. It is here, in this deliberate quiet, that the convergence of ambition, control, and solitude crystallizes. Every obedience extracted, every loyalty smoothed, every contradiction quelled, feeds the weight of inevitability. He believed, perhaps sincerely, that collapse would come from without. But the truth is that it had already happened within. The subtle joke of the situation is that the world, with all its chaos and unpredictability, is late to recognize patterns it did not arrange. And in this room, with only candlelight and the creak of wood for companions, there is the recognition that alignment, once achieved, is both a comfort and a subtle form of isolation. The sensation is neither satisfaction nor regret, but the quiet gravity of knowing that nothing could have happened differently, and yet everything remains fragile if observed from outside. Historians still debate whether this form of mental collapse is the product of genius or circumstance, of method or madness, and perhaps the answer is immaterial to anyone sitting in a room that has learned to wait. There is one final, almost imperceptible joke. The room, arranged with care, will continue to exist long after he does, unbothered by the consequences of the decisions that shaped it, and yet it will bear them quietly in its shadows. And so, the night presses on, not as an enemy, but as a witness. Power, once noisy and urgent, hums quietly. Ambition, once a pressure, now pulses gently against the walls of thought. Collapse, anticipated but silent, has taken its place, organized and patient. There is no need for announcement, for dramatics, for recognition. The mind has done its work, and the work is evident only to itself, in the measured flicker of candlelight, in the deliberate creak of floorboards, in the quiet satisfaction that something finally made sense and sits slightly wrong. The alignment is complete, not as a story to tell, but as a state to inhabit. He sits, unobserved, alongside the inevitable, and there is a faint, almost imperceptible humor in that fact. Perhaps it is in the rhythm of the wind, or the patience of shadows, or the solitary acknowledgement that the end had arranged itself long before it arrived. He had once believed that certainty would shelter him, and it has in ways both precise and isolating. The calm is not final. It is persistent, and it is invisible to anyone who expects spectacle. There is a final, almost invisible reminder that all of this, every calculation, every observation, every joke whispered in the margins of thought, exists not to be seen, but to be felt. The room, the flame, the floor, the wind, all converge into a single awareness that the mind has always been capable of arranging its own alignment. And when the night ends, the impression remains, lingering slightly wrong, as if something had finally made sense, but that sense carries a weight that no one outside this quiet room could recognize, let alone understand. The candle wavers again. Shadows lean against the wall. The room breathes slowly, with the rhythm of inevitability, and the quiet humor of it all persists in a way that is unmistakable only to the one who has waited, observed, and recognized that everything, every collapse, every alignment, every silent truth was already there, waiting for its own hour.